time between New York, New Jersey, and D.C.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our criminal justice panel, Criminal Justice Reform in 2019. I'm Jennifer Jones-Austin, and I serve as a board member of the National Action Network. And when I'm not doing that, I head up the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, a social policy and advocacy organization based here in New York City. So I'm your co-moderator for this panel, and I'm joined by Brandon Hicks, who will be co-moderating with me. I'm honored to serve as the moderator. It's an esteemed panel, and they have much more wisdom. I'm going to speak for Brandon and myself when I say than we do. And so what we're going to do is to try to talk as little as possible and hear as much as possible from them. I'm going to ask for your forgiveness right before we begin, because regrettably, I am going to have to leave us at the 5 o'clock hour. I've got a plane to catch to go to Miami. It's important to you all. It should be important to you all. It's important to me because I'm going to Miami to talk with the NFL about the poverty to prison pipeline. You know, very often we talk about the school to prison pipeline. And we need to pay significant attention to that. But I'm going to tell you that from the work that I do with organizations around this city and the state and the nation, we actually do ourselves an injustice when we talk about just the school to prison pipeline, because the intersection of race, poverty, and justice involvement is too significant to be ignored. When 40% of crimes are attributable to poverty, when 80% of the people who are incarcerated self-identify as being poor, when people who go into the prison system come out more poor and their families become poorer while they're there, we have to appreciate that what we have is not just a need for criminal justice reform in our courts, right? On the streets with respect to policing, we also have to look at the influence, how poverty factors into justice involvement. Not because poor people commit more crimes, but because we have a nation and as a system that is determined to further criminalize the poor, to put them at further disadvantage. So I'm going to head out of here in about an hour to go talk to the NFL because they say they want to pay attention to this. Amen? You know, I am also the daughter, the granddaughter, and the great-granddaughter of Baptist preachers, so when I say something, I need a little response. That's why you get a little amen. All right? So we're going to get to the heart of the matter. When we talk about criminal justice reform in the present day, it's exciting. You know, we've seen over the last several years that more and more attention has been paid to the importance, the need for criminal justice reform. Very often people think about it and they talk about it through the frame of what are we doing around policing? What are we doing around arrest rates? What are we doing around arraignments and prosecutions? What are we doing around the prison system? What are we doing with respect to reentry? What are we doing with respect to parole? What are we doing with respect to probation? Those are all very important issues, and I imagine in this next 2 hours and 20 minutes we're going to hit upon many of them. But before we go there, we need to step back and talk about, again, who is being arrested? Who is being incarcerated? As a member of the New York City Board of Correction, I can tell you that in all of my visits, and I've had more than 2 handfuls, maybe 3 times over, all of my visits to Rikers Island, I've been hard-pressed to find a white person, maybe in my probably about 20, 25, 30 times, I've probably seen about 10 white people on Rikers Island. But again, because of the intersection of race, poverty, and crime, justice involvement, we have to talk first about who's being arrested and why, and what more we can do to decriminalize poverty. So what I'm going to ask our panelists to do, if they'd like to respond to that, is to begin. I'm trying to cut down on time so we can really have a conversation here. Begin first by telling us who you are and what you do. If there's something that you have to get out in this moment, please get it out. And then I want you to talk to us about policies, systemic policies and practices that we should be looking at to work towards the decriminalization of poverty. Good to go? Yep. All right, so you all want to jump in? Go for it. I'm not going to call on you. Oh.
Ladies first.
For sure.
I want you, you're going to talk to me, you're going to tell us, you're going to tell everyone who you are. If there's something you need to get out, right? Because sometimes when people want to introduce themselves, they've got to get something out, right? So if you want to get it out, no more than 3 minutes or so, and then let's really get into the issues. I want you to talk about how do we best decriminalize poverty. Now, you are a DA, and you see a lot of people walking through the courts, right? And probably a lot of them are poor. What do we do to decriminalize poverty?
Okay, first, I am Darcel Clark. I'm the Bronx County District Attorney. I have been for the last 4 years. Thank you. Prior to that, I was a judge here in New York State for 16 years, and I did criminal trials and appeals. And I am now, as a district attorney, have worked on a number of ways to deal with the disproportionality of black and brown people coming through our criminal justice system. So I have done things like establish an alternatives to incarceration bureau to have those people who enter the system come there for various reasons. Poverty being one of them, mental illness, drug addiction. So we have a lot of programs to deal with those people to try to get them from coming into the system in the first place, prevention, as well as those that don't have to. We can do diversionary measures, and then even in sentences, making sure that we deal with the whole person and the whole case as we go forward.
Before we move on, can you say anything about some of the types of programs that you have so people can get a sense of what they are and what they look like?
Okay. So, for example, for those people who are entering the criminal justice system for the first time or have some experiences with the system but not anything serious, some of those low-level nonviolent situations, I started something called Project Reset Bronx Community Justice. And what that is throughout the Bronx, we have trained residents of the Bronx to be those mediators to hear those cases. So instead of it going into the criminal court, the community works with the person who has been accused of the crime, and they sit together. We call them peace circles, kind of like what the Native Americans started this type of tradition. And those individuals sit together and talk about the harm that was caused to the community. The person speaks about why they did the things, and at the end of it all, it's resolved in the community. Something like we used to do before. We took care of what we had to do in the community rather than it going into the criminal justice system. I started another program called or the Overdose Avoidance and Recovery Program. In the Bronx, we have the highest rate of drug overdose. The thing is that this is nothing new to the Bronx. We've always had this problem. I mean, the opioid epidemic now has become this because it is now in communities where it's never been before. But we've always dealt with this. So I have to deal with those high frequency utilizers who have been in and out, cycle in and out through the system because of their substance abuse. I started a program where when they're arrested for these low-level controlled substances or drug cases, heroin in particular, or other crimes that are related to their addiction, I stop the prosecution and offer them treatment right in arraignments. And they do this without having to plead guilty, which is totally different than a lot of the programs where people have to plead guilty first, and there's so many unintended consequences that comes with that conviction. I stop the prosecution, offer them the treatment. If they get engaged meaningfully, I dismiss the charges. I don't even bring it.
Excellent, excellent. Let's hear from our other district attorney, Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for including me in this afternoon's panel, and to my fellow panelists, it's a privilege to be up here with you. Sure, is that better? All right, good afternoon. First of all, I want to just say what a phenomenal partner District Attorney Darcel Clark has been in her years in the Bronx. I've been District Attorney in Manhattan for 9 years now. And trying to condense, I think, the question, it's a very big question with lots of parts, but I'd like to just focus on one question and then move to others. I think what we need to do is be very mindful of trying to only bring those folks into the criminal justice system who actually should be in it. We need to shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system as to who we're bringing into it and be very mindful. And this is what we've done in Manhattan. In 2012, there were about 86,000 police arrests for minor offenses and misdemeanors. Over the following 4 to 5 years, we have now reduced the amount of cases that we take from the police and bring into the justice system by about 50%, from 86,000 to 40,000 plus last year. That is, I think, how you address at large scale who's coming into the justice system. And unfortunately, we know that many people who may come in even for a minor offense, it can begin a process by which they return to the justice system because there's been no intervention that's helped them when they were first brought in the first place. So among many other things that we do, like District Attorney Clark, we have a number of diversionary programs, but I have been focusing on making sure that we try to reduce the number of folks that come in without sacrificing public safety, and we've done that. The two biggest categories of police arrests are marijuana and what we call theft of services or fare beating. And over the last 15 months, our office has essentially eliminated the prosecution of those offenses with some narrow exceptions.
That's tremendous.
And that was something that I think I felt there was going to be political opposition from the mayor and the police commissioner in a respectful way. But what was happening is we were arresting people arresting folks in a way that I thought was disproportionate to the harm itself. You can drive down the West Side Highway at 70 miles an hour to get a speeding ticket. But if you don't have identification and jump over a turnstile, you can go to jail. And that really doesn't make sense. So what we've done is try to be rational, be thoughtful about who comes into the system, and then there's much more that we do, which I can talk about later.
That's such an important point. I'm glad that you bring that up because one of the things that many of us who were advocating for fair fares in the 2018 budget, city fiscal year budget, found that here in New York City, about 30% of arrests for turnstiles and among people of color in the most marginalized, lowest income communities. So that's a big, big, big win, you taking that on, and we appreciate that. Donna Lieberman, New York Civil Liberties Union. Talk to us.
Yeah, hi. That's right. I'm the director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I am so excited to be here at NAN once again. So, hi, everybody. So, I think that there's so much that we as a society need to do and can do to end the poverty to prison pipeline, the school to prison pipeline, and to shrink our jail population and to end this epidemic of mass incarceration that has been the story of this country for decades. We need to remember it's no accident. This is a policy that was designed, it goes back to Nixon and Reagan, and only recently have we begun to reverse the war on drugs, which was quite decidedly a war on people of color. So, you know, I'm not so much about victory laps, but we need to take a bit of a victory lap right now because New York State just last week put into the budget, it's not all signed, I don't think, but you know, there's a deal, there's an agreement, and maybe it is signed, see, I don't even know, to end cash bail for a huge number of offenses. That is a big deal. It means that whether you're in jail, awaiting trial, whether you're really presumed innocent, doesn't depend on how much money you've got, but actually depends on like what you've been charged with. And if you're charged with a misdemeanor, for the most part, not all misdemeanors, right, you're entitled to be released pending trial. Big deal. We've reformed our speedy trial laws. I don't think it's enough, but we have to pay attention to that. And as we have fewer people in jail pre-trial, that should be a smaller problem. And we have greatly expanded our discovery process. Discovery is the sharing of information, the sharing of evidence between the DA and the defense counsel about what the person is charged for, what the evidence is against them. It levels the playing field when you know what the evidence is against you. It's huge. We now have just about the best discovery laws in the country. What we need to do, however, is we need to get rid of broken windows policing once and for all. I am so bummed out that we have a progressive mayor who insists that broken windows policing is a good thing. It is not a good thing. It sucks. It's a war on black people. We have to get rid of it as a philosophy once and for all. Broken windows policing is stop and frisk. It's enforcing marijuana offenses. It's arresting kids for riding a bike on the sidewalk, and it's about putting black people in jail. But we also
and let's just add, Donna, that you also it's very prevalent in predominantly black and brown communities.
We're like an old married couple. She finishes my sentences.
We're partners.
We are partners.
We're partners in all things good.
There's nobody better. But you know, another thing we have to make sure of is that everybody has represented by competent lawyers at every stage of the criminal proceedings. Because you can't fight the system, you can't defend yourself if you don't have a lawyer. Finally, I have so much to say, I won't say it all now, but I want to say one more thing. We have to end the philosophy of retribution and start thinking about rehabilitation. We have to think about what's good for society. And locking them up and throwing away the key is not good for society. So we need mental health services. We can't put people with mental health issues in and out of Rikers Island. We need to provide support services. And we can't throw people into the community without access to mental health services. Quite honestly, we have to hold Mayor de Blasio accountable. He did this whole Thrive NYC initiative, and he has yet to tell us what the results of it is. And we need to demand results. We need to demand effective and available services. Drugs are a public health issue. They should not result in life in jail. So I think that's a start. I got more, but I'll save it for down the pike.
You know, Donna speaks truth, and we're all speaking truth up in here, but as she spoke, I couldn't help but appreciate that we also have to think about, when we think about justice involvement, we have to appreciate that we're not just talking about the individual who becomes involved with the justice system. When a person becomes involved with the justice system, that person's entire family becomes involved with the justice system. And the issues that result, the consequences, are great and grave for the entire family. So if a father with children becomes justice involved, the family may fall deeper into poverty. Children experience trauma every day when their parents are incarcerated. So I'm just piggybacking on you, Donna, and saying that when we look at the harms, we have to appreciate that the harms extend beyond the individual who's been impacted directly. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. All right, let's go over to Scott Hetchinger from Brooklyn Defender Services.
Thank you all so much for having me. My name is Scott Hetchinger. I'm a public defender. My office, Brooklyn Defender Services, we represent half of everyone arrested in Brooklyn. So that's somewhere between 35 to 45,000 people a year. And let me tell you, being in court at arraignments, and I was in there today, and seeing who is coming through the system, who is being brought out from the back in shackles, who's waiting in the audience, not just predominantly, nearly all black or Latino, and nearly 100% living in poverty. I was actually with a young, fifth graders actually, and I felt kind of strange about bringing them in to see this. But they were equipped for it, and one of the kids said to me, they're all black. And then I asked the students afterward whether that means black people just commit more crimes, or what do they think about that? And another student, they all shook their heads and said, no, it just means that they're arrested more. And that's the truth. The reality is far too many people are arrested for far too many things, and they're largely, predominantly black or Latino people living in poverty in only certain neighborhoods. So when we're talking about the intersection of poverty and the criminal justice system, here's what I gotta say. We need to shrink the system, because you can't deter poverty with prison. You can't deter poverty with incarceration, with arrests. What you can do is stop arresting, so we need to decriminalize it, because declining to prosecute isn't enough. An arrest is damaging. We need to decriminalize it. We need to take the tools away from the police to have unnecessary interactions with the police, predominantly people of color, okay? And we need to instead reinvest those saved resources in things that actually help poverty, that help substance abuse, that help isolation and shame, that help homelessness, like poverty alleviation measures, like drug treatment, like mental health services, like fair fares, and you can do it one for one. Think about it. My clients come through and they're arrested with misdemeanor trespass. Stop arresting people for that and provide for more affordable public housing. Okay? Instead of arresting people for a crack pipe in their pocket, reinvest those resources in better substance abuse treatment programs. Instead of arresting people for sleeping, or for walking through the turnstile, enable them to afford public transportation. But it doesn't just start at what we let into the system. It also, and that's very visible. We see the impact of stop and frisk. But once people are in the system, how does poverty intersect with incarceration? How does poverty intersect with mass incarceration? It starts with bail, and as Donna said, huge win for justice. I can tell you, 87% of the time my clients have bail set, they can't afford it. Rikers Island, 89% of the population there is black or Latino. Okay? And most of those people are there, presumed innocent, not having been convicted of any crime or serving very short sentences. So there also needs, but even though we've passed this legislation, we can't ignore the fact that people who are charged with violent offenses are still going to be ending up there. And so to think about and to reframe our understanding of what drives violence, that's poverty too. Poverty, the traditional drivers of violence, is lack of economic opportunity, isolation, shame, and violence, and it perpetuates itself. Okay? And so that starts at the pretrial detention phase, which only exacerbates violence, and that also happens in prison, which are the most violent places you can imagine. Okay? And so we need to reckon with violence. We need to face our uncomfort or discomfort with talking about violence as well. And then I want to talk about on the back end. So after prison, folks come out. There's 47,000 laws of restriction nationwide that preclude people from re-entering society, from being whole. So you come out already more damaged than when you went in. You come out with a scarlet letter of a criminal conviction. And then you're further pushed out and marginalized by the inability to get work. In New York, our laws preclude people from living in public housing if you have many convictions, which means that you also can't live with your family, and if your family gets caught housing you, they can be evicted as well, okay? You're not eligible for student loans, okay? And this doesn't even touch the fact that people come out with mental health disorders and drug disorder, substance abuse disorders, even worse than when they went in, all of which leads to further poverty and reinforcement of the conditions that got them targeted by the police in the first place. It's a vicious cycle, and so we need to now start thinking about and listening, frankly, to the folks who are on the front lines. That is directly impacted people, majority. But you also, and I'm hoping, and this is something that public defenders are trying to do even more, listen to public defenders. Public defenders are traditionally maligned pretty much by everyone. Lawmakers think we're crazy, and they don't listen to us traditionally. This year, notwithstanding, which it's a big movement forward, they started listening to us. But our clients, too, we have major issues with trust in the community, and rightfully so based upon the history, okay? But what we're seeing now more than ever, I can tell you, are dedicated public defenders who come into the work not just thinking that they're going to be a cog in the wheel, but well aware of all the consequences, of the context within which mass incarceration is developed and currently exists, and with the firm understanding that it's not inevitable, and we want to work to get out of it. So please listen to us too. Nice. I'm eager to talk more about a range of issues, but thank you.
Well said. Thank you. I am going to turn to Reverend Jonathan Mosley of National Action Network to share your thoughts.
Thank you so very much to Reverend Sharpton and to distinguished panelists and to this great multitude of witnesses. I look at the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, because we wouldn't be here if we hadn't been targeted initially, economically and educationally. Not so long ago, I don't know about here, but in Cali, I'm from Los Angeles, we used to have programs, and we understood at that time everybody that wasn't going to go to college, matriculate in some great Ivy League school. We had programs where they could be mechanics.
I'm sorry.
Auto mechanics. There were plumbers, electricians, carpenters. And when they took that away from our community, it sucked literal life out until the point where the next thing they did, they put in, I hate to use this phrase, but I have to, is from New Jack City, Nito Brown, you know, he said, Miss Hawkins, we don't have no poppy fields, and we don't have any airplanes. So we were automatically targeted as a means to destroy us, separated the family, created a vacuum that has left us pretty much ravaged. I said, in looking at this in 1985, if we're not careful, the only way they'll know we were here, they can go to the Smithsonian. But because whether you believe it or not, based upon all these occurrences, black men getting shot down every day. Now it's not enough to shoot down our black brothers, they're shooting our sisters. Or they're taking them in. We had a situation out in Malibu. A young lady was arrested because she couldn't pay a $50 bill at a very exclusive restaurant. And all of a sudden, she is no longer, she disappeared. I don't know about here, but it just seemed unorthodox to let a young lady free at 3 o'clock in the morning and not giving her an opportunity to call her family to come pick her up. But they found her up, way up in the hills, and nobody knew nothing. Sandra Bland hung herself, really? And you want us to believe this. We have been people that have been resilient in dealing with everything that the system has thrown at us. Contrary to what the DA said, I don't trust district attorneys because they work for the system in the court. I'm just talking about California.
I think you were probably prepared for that.
In California, DAs are like a car wash. They push as many cases through as possible and as quick as possible to try to take people off the books on the board so that they won't go to trial. So a black man or Hispanic man or black sister doesn't have an opportunity to get a quality person of representation. Not only that, they always are putting an ink pen in their hand and say, sign this. Just sign this, just sign this. And a lot of young men and women have been railroaded and put in the prison system for things that were not even violent crimes. So, you know, it's pretty difficult, in all due respect to our district attorneys, but to sit there and say, trust them, I can't do that. Because I've seen too many of our people get railroaded, because it's also another game that we have to recognize, that the level of where they're trying to go. If they keep enough cases out of the court, then they move up. If they have aspirations to be judges or attorneys, by keeping enough cases out of going through the system, and what it does, it pushes more of our people into the prisons. Because whether we want to believe it or not, and I'm through, we have lost our usefulness to the system. We're not useful anymore, because we're not picking cherries and plums out in the field. They have another group that does that. And because of automation and because of technology, we're going to lose even more jobs, because we're not going to be able to be cash registers, or even if you notice at McDonald's now, they only have one person at the window, one person collecting the money, and the others are cooks. Where it used to be you could go and find a number of people in working, those jobs are slowly just dissolving. Look at, primary thing was, look at what happened to Detroit and automation.
Everyone up here is speaking their truth. Their truth. And what I am most confident in is that what we've assembled here today is a panel that has the very best intentions of doing all that we can to create a better, a stronger justice system that serves everybody right and righteously. So, I'm going to turn now to Johnny Perez, the director of the U.S. Prison Programs at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture.
Thank you. Thanks. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to all my esteemed panelists. As I hear everybody speak, not only do I not have much to add to all of the things that have already been said, but I do want to emphasize one or two things. You know, when I think about, you know, poverty in the criminal justice system, automatically I think about bail. And when I think about bail, I think about the story of Khalif Browder, who was just sitting inside of a jail cell for 3 years simply because he couldn't afford $900 to get out. And I think about, you know, when did we get to a place where we've actually created a two-tier system where those who are wealthy get a different type of justice and those of us who cannot afford it. And although New York has made great strides, and maybe other states, we need to understand that New York, that bail reform and a lot of these policies look different outside of New York. You know, you go to Idaho, for example, Wisconsin, the criminal justice conversation looks completely different there. You know, but poverty still impacts those communities there. Although they may not be predominantly black and brown in those spaces, poverty does kind of, it's like water, kind of flows in all of these crevices of society where people find themselves. And when you find poverty, you also find crime. And the responses in which we respond to crime are some of the policies in which we need to think about. You know, on one hand, we can't say that we value freedom, that we value justice, that we value safety, you know, that we value the preservation of the dignity of our fellow people, but on the other hand, have policies that don't reflect that. Policies that, you know, that demonize you and criminalize you for the rest of your life. You know, a person gets arrested for 1 week, right? That can lose your job. You know, not everybody has a job that can, you know, give you sick days or all these other days that we get, right? You know, the landlord still wants their money. The card note still has to be paid. You know, and so I think that in addition to the policies that we need to do, you know, to enact, right, broken windows policing and all of the things that have already been mentioned, that these resources really do need to be incorporated right back into the same community. how I came into this work was because I broke the law, and I eventually landed in prison for 13 years of my life, right? From the age of 21 to 34, and I'm 40 now. And during that time, I visited, I resided in about 9 different prisons, and I talked to people who had such amazing stories. You know, who you talking to them and you would never believe, you know, like they just don't belong there, you know. And I think about what kind of changes would have been impactful for these folks before they got arrested. And I think about the times when I've been arrested, you know, and how some crimes are a direct result of poverty, in the sense of, like, you know, there's people who are breaking the law to feed their food, or and then I'll say this last piece, that it's in addition to the policies, right? Because we can change all the policies tomorrow, but if the culture doesn't change, then it really doesn't matter, right?
Right.
And one of the reasons why I found value in my experience is because I really quickly realized when I was incarcerated that there's a huge space between policies in theory and policies in practice, right? And to be able to close that space, we have to be able to talk to those people who are impacted by these policies. So, you know, we need to be talking to these communities who are impacted by poverty, and exactly what it is that you need in your community, not tell you what it is that you need. I think about where I grew up at, right, in the Bronx, Parkchester and Gleason. And I remember mobile police towers. You know, I remember 24-hour pawn shops, as if people from my neighborhood have gold laying around at 3 o'clock in the morning to sell. You know, so when I think about all of those things and how that increases the likelihood that people will respond to, that would apply criminal solutions to their problems, you know, I think, you know, that's an area that, in addition to the criminal justice reform, we need to reinvest all of these saved dollars right back into the community, with the community involved in what exactly that it is that they need. Thanks.
Thank you. One of the things that you should be helping us all to appreciate, some of us are further along than others, is the importance of credible messengers in this space. Credible voices with lived experience that can help us better navigate, so that as we are affecting new laws, new policies, new practices, we're not just doing it theoretically, and it doesn't have real life application. So thank you for bringing your voice. One more person we need to hear from for this particular set, Spencer Boyer, Director of the Washington Office for the Brennan Center for Justice, NYU Law School. Please share with us.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks so much to the National Action Network for inviting me to join you today. It's really terrific to be here, and I'm honored to be here with such terrific panelists. With so many, I think, accomplished people on both the state and local level in particular, and since I'm in Washington, I thought that the value I could add to this panel is to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Brennan to reform our federal system, and in particular our efforts to end mass incarceration. And the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, we're part think tank, we're part advocacy organization, we litigate, so we do a little bit of everything. And then I look forward to our conversation. I'll keep this as tight as possible. At the Brennan Center, our primary strategy is twofold. Above all is to try to reduce the overall levels of incarceration around the country, full stop. We believe that this can be done safely through reducing overly long prison sentences and dramatically increasing alternatives to incarceration, and more on that in a second. Secondly, we focus on building strong public support for criminal justice reform nationally. One way we work towards this goal is to try to encourage federal action that both sparks national conversation as well as spurs states to action. So where are we in this process now? Fortunately, there has been some recent progress towards reducing incarceration at the federal level. Since 2013, the federal prison population has declined by about 20%. That's about 40,000 fewer people in federal prison. Okay, that's a nice start, but this trend is by no means guaranteed to continue, and it's certainly not enough. Under President Trump, the Justice Department has taken steps to reignite the war on drugs and reverse steps that we had taken away from mass incarceration. And President Trump's judicial nominations being confirmed at an historic pace, and Senator McConnell continuing to try to make that even faster. This is going to shape the federal judiciary for years to come, and I think most of us in this room would agree that these individuals will not be sympathetic to those accused of crime. Less publicized, but I think also alarming, Trump's nominees to the U.S. Sentencing Commission are, for the most part, unreformed supporters of mass incarceration. So while we've had a few ups, mostly downs on reform recently, but let me just have a little glass half full moment here. With the passage last year of the First Step Act in December, with strong bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, ending years of gridlock over federal sentencing reform. What does that mean for mass incarceration? So, you know, again, just start with, this is just a small first step, as the name implies, but I think it is significant in the sense that it reduces federal prison population and is moving in that direction. The act shortens mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. It also expands the drug safety valve, giving judges more discretion when sentencing nonviolent drug offenses. It makes retroactive the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which reduced but did not eliminate the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, which, as everybody knows, dates back to the 1980s and particularly hurts racial minorities. It expanded the time that people can earn off their sentences for good behavior. And while this good time fix only shaves off about 7 days per year off of sentences for those who qualify, that affects about 85% of the federal prison population. And the act also authorizes significant spending on prison reform programs, so that means more money for education and vocational training and so forth. So again, this is all good, but it's only a small step. And to fully fund the prison reforms in the First Step Act, the law requires about $75 million a year over 5 years, and President Trump's proposed budget includes just a fraction of that, even through a very generous interpretation of fund allocation. He did note at an event earlier this week at the White House celebrating the First Step Act that he's committed to fully funding, but we will see what happens over the coming weeks and months.
Moreover, I'm going to ask you, I'm really appreciating all that you're raising. We're going to talk a lot more about reforming the system, so I want you to hold on to some of that for just a few more minutes, okay?
Sure.
You're raising some very good points, and I think a lot of people will probably want to weigh in on some of this. We're good? Okay.
Sure.
So let me just, there's one more thing that I want to make sure we touch upon before we move into actual reforms that are taking place for people who are incarcerated around sentencing and more. In order to decriminalize poverty, there needs to be a greater engagement with individuals and organizations and institutions that are engaged in the work of fighting poverty on a daily basis. So some of our panelists have talked about institutions that provide everything from supportive housing to mental health services, workforce development. I would like to hear from some of the panelists, substance abuse treatment. How involved are you with social service, human service organizations, community-based organizations? Because truly, you cannot really engage in decriminalizing poverty just through the justice frame. You have to have partnership with human service organizations, dare I say with government, but you also need to be involved with faith institutions. So I know that you're doing some of this work, Mr. Vance, DA Vance, and I know you're doing some as well. Can you share with us, and then I'd like to hear a little bit about what faith community is doing, and others.
Thank you. Fighting crime is so much more than trying to take people off the streets who are committing crime. We fight crime just as much by investing in our communities. That is the strategy of our office, is to focus on crime prevention in addition to the traditional roles of district attorneys in dealing with rape, robbery, and serious crime. We've been blessed because of the good work of our office, our investigations division, to seize hundreds of millions of dollars from foreign banks. And from the proceeds of those ill-gotten gains, we have reinvested those dollars in New York City and in Manhattan. We made a $100 billion investment for NYCHA around public safety. It is, you know, NYCHA needs obviously so much help on so many levels. But I think importantly, another program is we're investing about $250 million into Manhattan crime prevention strategies. The core of that will be the creation of 5 youth hubs in 5 different neighborhoods in Manhattan. And the door in central Manhattan serves the entire city, Scott, so I hope you will think about us if there's a need. And what we found is that there are scores of extraordinarily good service providers across the wide range of services that neighborhoods need around focusing on supporting youth and families, supporting victims of crime, supporting people transitioning back from prison to the community. There's a vast network of service providers that are doing excellent work, but they are not identified and they are not funded because they are not big enough to attract grants. And so our goal was to essentially, through these 5 hubs, have the hubs act as a hub, and the spokes from that hub were to go to the local service providers, whether it's trauma-informed service for a young kid or it is a victim of sex assault who needs to be handheld as she goes through the justice system, and in that way get the dollars that we think will focus on supporting the community, not just at the top, but into the organizations that are doing the work in the community. So for us, among the many programs that we've done historically with the community partnerships unit, we are now investing heavily in our residents and in our communities and in supporting what they need to thrive, having listened to them and heard what they want.
Excellent. Thank you. Clark?
All right, well, in the Bronx, I'm not as lucky as Cy Vance to have all that asset forfeiture money. So what we do in the Bronx is a little bit more organic. I mean, I'm a daughter of the Bronx, you know, raised there my whole entire life, so it wasn't difficult for me to step back into the role of being in my community because I've never left. So therefore, my role now is to not only, you know, do prosecution. I see my job as threefold. Prevention, which is going into the community, dealing with the schools, community-based organizations, the clergy, business people, all to let them know that the DA's office is here to support them so that they don't have to ever see the inside of the police station or a criminal court or for me to have to prosecute them. That's what I work with every day. So engaging the community into, thinking more about their service as jurors to make sure that you have fair people on your jury. If you believe in your community, you should play a role in making sure that you make the decision as to what happens to those people that come through those doors. So I've engaged in that kind of way. We do workshops in the community for adults as well as kids. And basically, anything you need, I make sure that people know that the DA's office is there to help. So I am at the churches on the weekends, days, night, weekend, parades, community organizations, civic organizations, working with the Cure Violence community. All of these things I do because I want to better engage the community. Let them know I'm looking out for victims of domestic violence. I have a crime victims assistance unit that deals with the community. You don't even have to have been a victim of a crime, but having suffered from some type of trauma, where even if the case hasn't come through the system or it's already passed, we're there to help with therapeutic services, counseling, things of that nature to make the community more healthy. That's what I try to do each and every day. So as to one particular program, yes, I have some of those alternatives to incarceration that I make sure I do, but I'm also very involved in re-entry. I think that is so important. People are not used to the DA talking about re-entry. It's like, well, the DA sends you up and that's all, that's my job. I was a Supreme Court judge. I've sentenced countless people to numbers of years in prison. But as a DA, I know better. And even as a judge, I learned these people left this community, and when they get out, they got to go back somewhere. And where do they have to go? Back to the community they came from. They should be able to come back to their community after serving their time, but we have to give them the resources and the tools to become productive members of society so that they don't reoffend, so that I don't have to re-prosecute them, so that they don't cause more harm to our community. Because let's face it, some of us have to own the fact that, you know, the crimes that happen, I have to protect the victims of the crimes and the witnesses to the crime. We all live in these communities and we know who did these things. And people don't want to snitch and all of that, and I get it, but I have to be able to hold people accountable that bring harm to the community. But once they do, they have to be allowed to be able to reset themselves, come back into the community, and be more productive. So I have the Bronx Reentry Task Force, and I hold resource fairs for those men and women who come back that need housing, education, be able to get identification, all of those things that you need to get yourself back on your feet to be productive. The DA's office is helping to bring that to the community.
Thank you. I hate to go, but I gotta go. I walk away feeling very encouraged by what I've heard thus far, and I leave you in the very, very capable hands of Brandon Hicks.
So, Reverend Mosley, do you have thoughts on that last question that was asked?
Oh, we do. We have a plethora of different organizations that we work with in trying to help people, but what we're really focusing on now is trying to keep them from going in, first of all. Old folks used to say, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So our aim and our mission is to make sure that we provide enough support within the community, working with our youth movement as well as the rest of our main office to try to keep the young people and older people from having to use the alternative going into incarceration, and if so, giving them the necessary tools to work while they're in, so when they come out they can start out running.
Thank you. And Scott, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so first I want to say two things. First, what our defender office does and what increasingly public defender offices are starting to do, which is recognize that the issues that, you know, intersect with mass incarceration, who's coming through the system, it's not just, we can't just fight the fight inside of court. We've got to recognize that it has to do with so much else. So we have specialists. Anytime I pick up a case, I think about the range of needs. And so we have a housing unit. We have the largest family defense practice in the entire city. Folks who defend, attorneys who defend parents who have criminal justice involvement from having their kids taken away. We have education attorneys. We've got a reentry team led fully by people who have been formerly incarcerated. We've got a new community office right on the cusp between Brownsville and East New York, so an area where most of our clients come from. We've got a youth unit, mental health unit. So we're engaged not only in our office with our clients, but we of course also work with community organizations. The one other thing I want to just say is, DA offices, you don't need civil asset forfeiture money to do good in the community, okay? First of all, you can save an enormous amount of money if you stop prosecuting poverty, if you stop prosecuting drugs, if you stop prosecuting petty larceny, stealing a bar of soap from a bodega, stop prosecuting trespass, suspended licenses, marijuana, and on. That would save an enormous amount of money, okay? And then that's civil asset forfeiture, just so you all know, is essentially legalized theft by the state. Okay, people can hold, the state can hold on to your property, to your money, even before you've been convicted, and frankly, even after you've been exonerated, okay? So number two, DAs have enormous political clout in Albany and throughout the country in their state legislatures. And so if they go and they step up and they say there are better ways to spend the money that you otherwise would be giving to us, to criminalize everything and to prosecute everything and to incarcerate everyone and actually reinvest in the communities, that would do an enormous amount of good. So you don't need civil asset forfeiture money to do what's needed in the communities to actually solve poverty instead of making it worse.
Thank you, Scott. So a large part of this panel discussion is about preventing justice involvement. And so at the National Action Network, we've been working on something called the POST Act. And the POST Act would create a law in New York City where the police department would have to report the surveillance technology that's being used. So we know that black activists and Muslim communities are disproportionately impacted by this kind of thing. And so my question is, what are you all's thoughts on surveillance and how we can curtail surveillance, and what impact will that have on the disproportionate rates of arrest for Black and Hispanic folks?
You spoke so fast.
I'm sorry, I'll slow down. We're talking about three things on this panel. We're talking about preventing justice involvement, reforming the criminal justice system, and reforming the prison system. When we're thinking about reforming justice involvement, preventing justice involvement, we know that Black folks and Muslim communities are highly surveilled, whether that be stop and frisk or using technologies to surveil activists. And so our question is, what are your thoughts on ways in which we can rein in the disproportionate surveillance of low-income Black and Hispanic communities? So, who wants to go first?
I can weigh in on that. I think that we need to have more transparency and accountability controls for police departments. Policing has really gone through a lot of high-tech improvements. Many surveillance tools, though, are shrouded in secrecy with little accountability to the public and even to elected officials, city council members, and so forth. And you have data-driven tools that are, trying to do predictive policing that can obscure racially biased inputs that are used to justify surveillance of Black and brown communities. So, at least at the Brennan Center, our recommendation is that you need to have some third-party auditing for these algorithmic tools that are being used to try to predict, and often are infected with racial bias from the beginning.
You can just go down the aisle if people have thoughts.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I'll go a step further and say that we need more on accountability, and that we just need to redirect resources from police departments and cut their, staff lines in half. Like the NYPD is one of the biggest is one of the biggest police departments in the country. Over-resourced, spends millions and millions of dollars a year, and of course they're concentrated, focusing on surveilling Black and brown communities. So in addition to holding them accountable, we need to redirect the resources that they're using in order to keep, in order to keep her surveilled, whether it's reinvested back in the community or supportive network, support for folks in that community.
I want to talk about a different form of accountability really briefly, which is in court. Under the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, the 4th, 5th, and 5th Amendments, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no coerced confessions, essentially no stop and frisk without justification. Stop and frisk came later. But the reality of and so the court system was supposed to be set up for us, for public defenders and our clients, to be able to challenge bad unconstitutional police practices, stop and frisk. But the reality of the system of pleas, 95% of convictions come from plea deals, 99% of cases never make it to trial, is that bad police practices get insulated. 40% of cases plead guilty on the same day of arraignments. So an officer can be on the street, walk up to a client of mine, rifle their hands through his pockets without any justification, and know that before he wakes up and is on his next shift, there's already a successful prosecution. He's got that notch in his belt, okay? And even in those cases, where rarely I'm able to cross-examine a police officer about an unconstitutional arrest, and even in that sense, when a judge actually deems them incredible, here's what happens in reality. The prosecutors, who I at least work with, continue to rely on their word for further arrests. And even after that, even after they're found incredible, they're still kept on the force, they're relied upon, and they're relied upon. I just had a case where the same judge who found them incredible relied on that same officer's word to sign a search warrant for a house. So you have this this sense of insulation. And with insulation and lack of accountability, there's a sense that you can do anything. And so a small lie in a piece of paperwork turns into a lie in open court, turns to excessive use of force, turns to Eric Garner's killer, who's still on the force making a 6-figure salary today. So accountability needs to be stepped up in a big way.
Yeah, just real quick, I forgot to mention. I'm on the New York State Advisory Board with the New York State Advisory Board to the Civil Rights Commission, and last year we actually interviewed about 70 advocates, folks who are working, to limit police brutality, and even NYPD brass. And one of the most shocking things that came out of that public hearing was what the NYPD has called Operation Crew Cut. And for those of you who don't know, what that is that where the NPD is tracking its kids as young as 13 years old, based on their social media interactions, right, or even suspected gang involvement. We know what that can mean, right? That can mean anything. And literally following them and tracking them all the way up to the age of 21 and 22 years old, and that was super alarming. So when I say that we need to redirect resources and even cut the police force in half, is because a lot of these programs where public doesn't really know about a lot of times are happening, and as a result of being resourced. Thanks.
DA Vance.
I want to follow up on a point that Scott raised, where I think we have substantial agreement. And we have been, it's important for us in evaluating a case at the beginning to understand whether there has been a confirmed, there has been misconduct by a police officer that has been confirmed through internal review by the NYPD. And it's been our position that we should get that information at the front of the case, because we want to know exactly who we're dealing with as our witnesses. And so we have been working, trying to get this information from the NYPD. We are hopeful that they will change their position, but like Scott, I understand the importance of getting information that may be exculpatory to the case early on, and to not have it be something that is maintained out of sight, that would otherwise affect whether or not the case might even be brought. So it's an important issue that Scott's raised, and one that I think prosecutors have some common ground on.
What I'd like to say about it is that, you know, DAs, we have tremendous amount of discretion, and that means I could prosecute a case, and sometimes it could say I don't have to prosecute a case. Just because NYPD brings me a case does not mean that I have to prosecute it. And quite frankly, I have been in a lot of discussions with NYPD because they're not happy with the fact that there are plenty of times where I refuse to prosecute the cases that they bring me because I see something wrong with it, something illegal, something that the police have done that they should not have done. So therefore, it's up to the DAs to ask the right questions. We don't take everything they say word for word. I have to be able to discern that it was legal and that there was actual probable cause. Now, when we go forward with the case and it's determined later on, we find out some discrepancies, well, that's when we decide that we have to deal with it. If it gets to a judge and they find the police officer incredible, this is the actions that I take. One, I automatically notify the police department so that they can do an internal investigation. But I have gone further than that. There are times when police officers actually have done things wrong, and I have prosecuted them. So therefore, you know, there's a lot of different ways that you can handle it. But we have to be more transparent. It has to be an even playing field. We have to make sure that, and part of my responsibility is to make sure that I not only protect the victims and the witnesses of the crime, but my job is also to protect the rights of the accused, to make sure that they are getting a fair system that they can go through in order, you know, to determine whether or not we, the DA, proves the case beyond a reasonable doubt, because they don't have the burden of proof. So there's a lot of things that we could do, and I think we could all be in agreement. We need to know these things about these police officers, and we're in a fight, the DA's offices now, with the police department in order to learn these different things about them. It's a fight that's going to be resolved in the courts. But I could continue to ask for it. The judge could order me to turn it over. But if they don't give it to me, it's not the DA that's refusing. Then the courts need to hold the police department accountable for what they're failing to give us so that we can turn it over to the defense.
Thank you. Ms. Lieberman, the Queen of Civil Liberties here in New York.
I have a lot to say. Where to begin? You know, technology is a double-edged sword. We know that all too well. And whenever they promise us that technology is the answer to all our prayers, all our problems, you know, you better watch out. That's right. And I think that, you know, the Post Act is an important step to make sure that the NYPD comes clean-ish about the technology it's using. But our law enforcement people, our education system, our government should never be allowed to tell us that they're using some cockamamie formula that they call an algorithm, and all our eyes glaze over because we don't understand how they got to the equation. It's called the fudge factor, right? As a basis of deciding who we are, what presumptions we're entitled to, whether we're going to get into jail, get out of jail, get into this school, get out of that school, right? Algorithms have racial bias built into them, and there is right now no oversight whatsoever. I shouldn't say all algorithms have racial bias built into them, but we don't know whether they do or they don't, and we need to find out, and the government should not be allowed to use any algorithms unless there is transparency. Trade secret, schmade secret. We need to know what is going into the soup. Number one. Number two, ComStat. Remember ComStat? That's like the whole NYPD crime fighting thing. Data, we need data. We go where the crime is, whatever, right? What about ComStat for cops? You know, what about a tracking system so that we know where the bad seeds are, where the bad apples are, where the bad actors are, right? It's about time. It's long overdue. We need to know which cops have 95 CCRB complaints for abuse of force, right? We need to know that information. And what about 50A? Have you heard of 50A? I'll tell you what 50A is. 50A is a law that has been interpreted and has been invoked to basically put a shroud of secrecy over the bad acts of police officers and corrections officers. And it has no place in New York City or New York State. We need to repeal 50A and stop legalizing the cover-up of police wrongdoing. I would hope that my DA colleagues on the panel, and I didn't do my homework, so I don't know where you stand. This is an honest question. Do you support the repeal of 50A? I hope the answer is yes for both of you. I want to say another thing about the school-to-prison pipeline. We haven't talked about it yet. And I mean, we got to shut it off. We have to stop putting cops in charge of school discipline. And we have to hold Mayor de Blasio accountable to shut off the school-to-prison pipeline. I say that because while there's good news in New York City, a lot fewer kids are getting arrested, a lot fewer kids are getting summonses for misbehavior in school. That's true. The mayor has yet to come through with a memorandum of understanding that says unequivocally that school discipline is a matter for educators, not cops. That's important work that has to be done. Because and the other thing is, you know, we have the lowest crime rates in like really decades, you know, maybe per capita in history, certainly in my lifetime, and that's a long time. So where is the peace dividend? Where is the reallocation of resources so that when my kids go to school, they don't see, well, my grandkids, they don't have to run through a gauntlet of metal detectors and cops, but instead they have access to soccer and baseball and basketball after school. Where is the reallocation of resources so that instead of the school safety division of the police department having to deal with providing programs or understanding or not giving out summonses, all 5,000 of them, we have guidance counselors and social workers and psychologists for kids who need services and support. Where is the reallocation of resources? You know, I am sick and tired of it being politically, you know, efficacious to support more cops. We don't need another cop. We don't need another school safety officer. We need guidance counselors. We need sports programs. We need community programs, and we need housing.
Thank
Talk
you.
about it, Tom. Talk about it.
Reverend Mosley.
Orwell wrote a book, 1999, Big Brother's Watching You. And my problem is, who's watching them? We don't bomb churches, we don't bomb mosques, we ain't never burned no crosses on nobody's lawns, we haven't drugged nobody out of nobody's house, we have not separated children. I mean, if there's a surveillance, it needs to be in, not only in the police department, but those folks that's up and making these policies up in the White House. Why wasn't there surveillance on them? And all of these things that we're seeing coming out about them, I mean, how many of 45's cabinet has been removed or have left or have now found their way into the jail? The focus has been designed to look at us. Why? Why is it so important that they look at us? We have to take in consideration, they killed our leaders, they put drugs in our community, they took away our resources, they took away our economics, took away our education, but they having surveillance on us. What are they looking for? We don't have nothing. We have never gone to no marathon and placed no backpack with a bomb in it. But they're surveilling us. They have so much time and technology to look at us when all the other crimes are going on right around them, and they're the ones that have been the progenitors of these crimes. So why in the world are you making such an emphasis on surveilling us? I know we're important.
We are.
And I know we look good.
We do.
And I know, I want to be black. They have taken too much time to try to destroy everything that we have tried to build up. You look at Black Wall Street, independent. We wasn't bothering them. And maybe that's the problem. When we don't bother them, they ain't happy, so they got to do something to bother us.
Thank you, Reverend Mosley. So, with the same idea of preventing justice involvement, earlier Dave Vance was talking about his efforts to decriminalize fare evasion, and there's a big push to legalize marijuana here in the state. Will these really lead to a panacea for black folks? Will this decrease the number of our arrests? So we can go down that line, or if anybody has thoughts on this.
When you speak the other way, we can't.
Oh,
Straight up now.
sorry. I apologize, everyone. So there have been big pushes to legalize marijuana here in the state, and there are pushes in Manhattan to legalize fare evasion. So will these efforts really lead to black folks not getting arrested?
Well, I can
Are you kidding?
start with it.
Are you kidding?
First and foremost, I just want to say I disagree a little bit with what you characterize. If someone doesn't pay a fare, there should be some consequence for that. There should be consequence, whether it is you have to go to perform community service. That's a mistake of what our office's position. What we are saying is you shouldn't be arrested. That arresting someone for not paying a fare is just simply disproportionate unless there's a public safety emergency going on. So that's number one. But number two, I think the answer is yes. If we are much more rational about who we bring into the justice system, that is going to end up reducing significantly, I believe, the number of men and women of color who come into the justice system, which I think is one of the thrusts of your question. And so I do think that we can create a fairer, more balanced system if we are much more careful about exercising our powers as prosecutors.
I mean, let me respectfully, disagree. I actually don't think that the clients who I know who jump the turnstile need to do community service. Frankly, like my clients are not jumping the turnstile for fun. $550 round trip for my clients is an extraordinary amount of money. Public transportation is necessary in New York. It's necessary to get to job interviews. It's necessary to get to drop your kids off at school, to work, to get to health appointments. And $550 is out of range for most people. And so I don't think, again, you can't deter that need and that poverty with just, with arresting them and giving them 2 days of community service. What you can do is stop arresting and stop prosecuting them and reinvest those resources and forget fair fares. Full, just indigent Metro cards, free Metro cards for those who actually qualify and need them. But what I would say is that yes, of course, decriminalizing crimes of poverty will, by its nature, prevent, reduce the number of Black and Latino people coming through the system. 92% of the people arrested for jumping the turnstile are Black or Latino. 86% of the people who were arrested for marijuana possession, smoking marijuana, were Black or Latino, despite what we all know, that white people smoke at least, if not more, than black folks. Last thing I'll say is, though, that decriminalization is not enough for marijuana, and for a lot of other things too, but let's talk about marijuana. Even if, right now, actually, you might be surprised, marijuana is decriminalized, and it has been in New York since in the 1970s. It just means that the police have discretion to arrest you for a violation, not a crime, instead of arresting you for a crime. And it means that the prosecution has the discretion to charge you with that violation, not a crime. But as long as a crime is on the books, marijuana is outlawed, let's assume the police get to a point where they are not arresting anyone for marijuana. Let's assume we get to a place where the prosecutors are not prosecuting anyone for marijuana, no matter what exceptions they come up with. Marijuana will still drive broken windows policing. The odor of marijuana will still provide reasonable suspicion and probable cause that'll allow for stop and frisks. It will turn already pretextual car stops into full-blown car searches. So until it is legalized, and that legalization takes into account the fact that the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs need to be leading the new industry that's established, and the funds that are saved get reinvested into the communities, we're not doing the right thing. So that's why I am for legalization, and I hope you all are too.
Mr. Perez. I have much to add. I don't think that it'll, something, the criminal justice doesn't ask why people do things. It just says you did it, right? So for example, right, if a person is arrested for hopping a train, right, $250, $5, the system doesn't ask you why did you hop the train today. They say you did it, you should pay the crime, so on and so forth. But if you find out that this person used their last $5 to feed their son, and just hopping the train because they don't want to lose their job, because they don't have one of those jobs I mentioned about earlier, then our responses will be different. And understand, well, you don't need community service, bro. You need a job, right? In my last role, I worked at the Urban Justice Center doing reentry advocacy, and I can see the number of clients that I had who were arrested for things like sleeping on a park bench, and then get like a $200 fine, and they're like, Johnny, like, how am I supposed to pay this? Like, hello. Right? If I'm sleeping on a park bench, it's because I don't have $250, right? But the system doesn't ask for that, right? We talk about, well, all we have to do is punish you, hold you accountable. You hear that word accountable, right? And you heard punishment, you hear punishment, and understand that there's a big space between accountability and punishment. They both look different. I can hold you accountable, right, without punishing you. I can still do that in a way in which preserves your dignity, humanity, where I can see you, right? And still hold you accountable for what you did. And this is coming from, I'm a father, so I get that, But besides the decriminalization, right? We have to really center, right? Like have a holistic approach to try to modify whatever the behavior is. And a lot of times it doesn't lead to incarceration. It doesn't lead to handcuffs. It doesn't lead to whatever community service looks like. It looks like a need that has not been filled in the community.
I certainly agree with all of that, and decriminalizing certain offenses like recreational marijuana use would, of course, decrease the overall involvement of black and brown people in the criminal justice system, and for that reason we should support it. But as everybody knows, black and brown people are overrepresented in every aspect of the system, from arrest to charging to bail determination to sentencing, so decriminalizing certain offenses isn't going to change the systematic failures that we have. And certainly my organization and our research, we still think the most effective way to help communities that are suffering from the effects of mass incarceration is, of course, to dramatically shrink the entire system. And the most effective way to do that is through shortening sentences and through moving away from incarceration as the default punishment for many crimes.
Now, this is the question on decriminalization of marijuana and theft of services?
Yes.
All right, well, this is what I think. I am no longer prosecuting those cases as well, and this is the reason why. I've had a lot of conversations with NYPD, and I mean, I get it just like you. There are several of us here that pay our fare, and then there are people who don't. So I believe in the accountability piece, but I think we could do it without putting people through the system. If you're going to take the time to have police there ready to arrest somebody for hopping the train for $2.75, instead of putting the cop behind the turnstile, put him in front of the turnstile. Then people think twice about whether or not they're going to do it, right? So people will pay who have it. Because I can tell you a lot of times people get arrested for it and they had $2.75 in their pocket. Now, the thing is that once the police encounter, and this is a good way for the police to start building a better relationship with the community. Just like you talked about, a person may have hopped that train because they spent their last $5 to feed their kid. If they're able to have that conversation at the gate of the turnstile, to say to the officer, look, I know I should pay, I'm going on a job interview, whatever those things are, that's community building. That's relationship building with the police. And they're not taking advantage of that particular way of doing things. That's what I tell them. I'm not going to prosecute them. Did they have the $2.75 before you brought them here? If they had it, why didn't you just let them pay the fare? Why spend all the money going through the whole police process? So that's what you're talking about, reallocating of funds. That money could be used for us to concentrate on in the community. Fair fares, I stood up for that. I believe in that. People that don't have, we need to set up systems so that we can make it so that they can be able to afford to pay to use the public transportation. So prosecution is not the answer. Decriminalizing, I think, will help. And coming from the Bronx, I know if it's disproportionate of black and brown people being represented in those particular categories, it's even higher in the Bronx that I have to deal with. So therefore, I don't want to see people criminalized. People need to be able to go on with their lives and get the job and get the education they need. I'd rather see the money put into that than dragging them through the system for a fair beat, and when they get before the judge, they'll probably go home, or they at least should go home by then after having gone through that whole process.
Thank you, DA. Ms. Lieberman?
So I don't want to jump the gun on an issue that may come from you, but I think we have to deal with the issue of parole reform. There are tens of thousands of New Yorkers who have done their time and are out on parole in New York State. And there are also thousands of people in Rikers Island and the state prisons on technical violations of parole, like failing to report, breaking curfew, having a dirty drug sample, and like that is ridiculous, it is inhumane. People go back to jail until their case is adjudicated. Once they're picked up, people go back to prison for minor technical violations. If we as a society are determined to end mass incarceration and rehabilitate people, then let's allow people to get rehabilitated, to function in society, and not throw the book at them every time there is a minor screw up. So, and there is legislation in the state legislature now to overhaul our parole system. Time is long past due for that. The other thing I want to say is there's one kind of mass incarceration that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the war on immigrants. Our jails have fewer people in pretrial detention facing criminal charges these days, and more people in jail for trying to get into this country to seek refuge and asylum, okay? It is time for us to name what the president is doing to immigrants, people who have been living here for decades on green cards, as well as people who are coming here as refugees, as what it is, which is a war on immigrants, an attempt to fill our jails with well-meaning, hard-working people who seek nothing but the ability to take care of their families.
Can I add?
D.A. Vance.
Rock.
I want to just say that I totally agree with Donna, starting first on her analysis of parole. Of the folks who are going back to state prison each year, about 65% of them are going back for a technical parole violation. And we really don't have this done right in New York. There's, as she said, Assemblymember Mosley has put forth the Less is More Act, which I support. And it would take for every 30 days of parole that you are successful out, 30 days comes off your parole. So you essentially are shortening the time period of paroles, you're saving money, you're not sending people to prison for technical violations. We are wasting huge amounts of money. We are, I think, being cruel to individuals, pulling them out of the community for minor infractions. And this is an area where there is law on the books, there's law that could be on the books this year, and I hope the governor and the legislature pushes for it. That's great.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience. So everyone, any closing remarks? We're going to start with you, D.A. Vance.
We're going to take, I'm sorry everyone, I'm Michael Hardy, I'm the General Counsel, Executive Vice President of the National Action Network. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take 7 questions, and then we're just going to take your questions so that the panelists have your questions, and then they will wrap up by both answering your questions and making whatever final comments. Is that all right, Brandon?
Thank you.
All right. I like that. Okay. So we're going to come over here. I'm just taking the first 7. All right. And of course, Brandon, just make some notes in case we need to repeat any of them. All right. What's your question?
In terms of fairness, which I appreciate the panel talking about, I feel like there are 2 ways to be unfair. One is to disadvantage me. The other way is to give an inordinate advantage to someone else. What I'm saying is I'm seeing cops who commit crimes that are not being penalized in a way that if any of us did the same thing, we would be. I'm seeing mayors making statements against actors who may or may not have made a false statement, but when cops perjure themselves and it's documented and proven, there are no consequences. So how can we feel like we're going to get the justice that we deserve if the other end of the equation isn't being balanced, where the people who deserve to be punished are not being punished?
Okay. Make a note on that, Brandon. That's question number 1.
My name is Henrietta Cromedy, and I want to know, my name is Henrietta Cromedy, and I want to know how can we get outside when a police is brutal and brought up on charge, if he ever, can we get it outside, someone outside of the city, outside of state, a person to, judge?
An independent prosecutor outside.
Related to police phone?
And I assume in that question, in New York State, currently, with regard to police shootings, the New York State Attorney General has jurisdiction if it's in shooting that involves an unarmed person. Are you saying beyond that you think it should be more independent? Okay.
Today we're talking about solutions for decriminalizing poverty. There is a candidate who has a platform suggesting universal basic income as one of the benefits or things that it will help is affect poverty. My question is this something that should be talked about as one of the solutions or a reasonable solution for decriminalizing poverty by putting money into people's pockets, therefore they don't need to do things like jump the turnstile? Or if not that, what policy should candidates be talking about as a solution for decriminalizing poverty?
All right, thank you. This is question number 4.
How's it going? My name is William Pugh. I'm a junior at Howard, studying philosophy and political science.
Howard you?
No? All right. My question is today we've talked about what the criminal justice system shouldn't be, and I'm kind of curious if you guys could maybe speak a little bit about what you believe the purpose of the criminal justice system should be. I don't even like to call it the criminal justice system. I call it the criminal injustice system. But whether that be, restraint or, obviously I don't think we think the criminal justice system should be used for retribution, but whether it be restraint or restorative justice or rehabilitation, I'm kind of just curious, what can we do to move toward criminal injustice to criminal justice?
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, panel. My name is Dr. Marcus, and I'm the community director here in Brooklyn. I just want to say that we are all speaking about decriminalization of poverty and so forth. Now, I want to know who's willing to stand up and take the lead in enforcing the laws that should be enforced against people. Now, we have policies. Policies are not laws. And right now, our people are being put in jail based on policies, right? We have to go back to common law instead of maritime admiralty law that's practiced in these courts. This is why our jails are being filled up based on policies. I want to know who's going to take the lead to change that.
Thank you. This is question 6.
Hello, I'm just interested in what's happening with these children they took out of Rikers Island. What is going on with them now?
Can we ask you to repeat that question, please?
Say that again.
These young people that they took out of Rikers Island, since they were going to close it, what is being done with these children now?
Okay. Okay, thank you. So last question.
Yes, my name is Dolly Brooks, and I would like to know or get some opinions about the fact a lot of times we have a triad of the police, the lawyer, and attorney coming against the person that they're prosecuting, and I've seen sometimes whereas the DA is the DA at one time and then he's an offender at another time. So, I'd like to get some questions and some answers, about that right there, because I really, truly feel that that is so unfair. And, maybe someone can speak on that.
All right. Brandon, we're going to give it back to you to get the answers and the closing statements. And let me just say, on behalf of National Action Network, we are enormously appreciative, number one, of all of you that turned out today. Give yourselves a big hand. And of course, our panelists, all of whom are very engaged, and to take the time to come and to be with you and to make themselves available to you. Give them a big hand. And Brandon, you got it.
So the first question was about fairness, police accountability, and Jussie Smollett. So what?
Are we doing them all together?
Yes. Whoever has an answer, we're going to just whoever has an answer for this. But the first question was, do citizens receive the same treatment that police do? Is there the same accountability for police as there is for a regular citizen?
It's more about how do we...
And how do we change that? Any thoughts?
Well, your former chief, Bratton, said about changing policies, but one thing we already know, police don't police police. So we have to have an answering one situation, and we attempted AB 284, which is an independent police commission that looks outside. These are not officers. They have no officer or police affiliation, because with another set and fresh set of eyes, they tend to see things more objectively as opposed to police changing things, tapes not coming out at a proper time, always getting held back. Anything could happen. We know certain things get doctored up. Another thing is, if you got a DA or AG, do your job and prosecute them. You saw what we saw, and you see how these officers have reacted. I think that there should be a policy that if these officers come into these kind of situations, they should not have paid administrative leave. Number two, when convicted, if somebody has enough strength to convict them, that they lose all of their seniority and they don't have no retirement. You start hitting them in the pocket, they'll stop all that shooting.
So that it's not pay to play in every aspect of our lives. You ought to be able to get a decent education, whether you pay to play or whether you go to public school. Well, duh, right? And so I think that a whole economic restructuring of the country, which would not be hard, and yes, let's make the wealthiest among us, or among them, really pay back to society and support others who are less fortunate, or others who have been systematically stripped of their opportunities in this country over hundreds of years since slavery.
Thank you. The gentleman from Howard asked, what should be the purpose of the criminal justice system?
What should what?
What should be the purpose of the criminal justice system?
I can try.
What should be the purpose of the criminal justice system?
I would just throw out there, certainly holding people accountable, but in the right way. And that's a large part of what we've been talking about today, is we're not doing it in the right way, and keeping communities safe, and especially the communities of color that are often the brunt of a lot of crime. And so I think that we can do this in a much smarter way, and obviously we've been talking about mass incarceration not being the answer, always looking first to criminalize and to imprison not being the answer. And I think that if we can move past that and think about things that actually work, given that most studies show that mass incarceration not only doesn't improve the situation, it makes it worse. When we don't think about people coming out and how to reintegrate them into society, we're making the problem worse. So I think sometimes people think of criminal justice in a negative way, but it doesn't have to be. It's just how we've approached it.
Thank you. The next question is...
Wait, I just want to say something. So there are bad guys and bad guys. There are crimes that we all hate, and there are crimes that we're not so worried about. I got to say, zero tolerance should never be our mantra. Zero tolerance screws good people and makes them sacrifice for a lifetime for a bad moment. Right? So we have to have a criminal justice system that is fair and just, never about zero tolerance, never about mandatory minimums, never about lock them up and throw away the key. Now, I think that drunk driving is dangerous to our country. It's dangerous to our kids. It's dangerous to people who are on the road. It's dangerous to innocent people. It destroys families. But let me tell you, why do we need to lock them up and throw away the key? Don't you think that there are lesser ways to stop drunk driving or to teach people a lesson, right, than destroying more lives? So unfortunately in our system of justice, like mitigation and consideration of what happens to the perpetrator happens only to white people. You know, it's the white people are the only beneficiaries of that. Not the only, but mostly. You know, that's why the opioid crisis is suddenly a public health crisis, but every other drug crime is like, you know, criminal. But rather than doing bad for everybody, let's do good for everybody. Let's seek justice and rehabilitation for everybody.
Brandon.
Mr. Perez.
Yeah, I think I'll add something real quick, and thank you for that, Don, on the other side of the aisle. You know, like I told you before, I spent a lot of time in prison, and you know, I've spoken and have shared space and even broke bread with a lot of the folks who you probably wouldn't even want to sit next to. And you know, when you hear these folks' stories, right, and you hear the harm that they've done, right, you also come to understand that they've also been harmed themselves. You know, and our system doesn't center necessarily the harm that's been done, or I should say, center crime victims in a way in which we ask them what it is that they want. You know, if we ask a person who's been who's a crime victim what it is that they want, a lot of times they don't want incarceration. And I highlight the work of Common Justice led by Danelle Surratt, who actually surveyed hundreds of crime victims and said, what do you want? And the top 3 were not incarceration at all. You know. So I do believe in the idea of restorative justice. You know, I think about the times that during my time where I was actually impacted, right? It was education. You know, it just so happened that I discovered education while I was incarcerated, which is another conversation. You know, but the impact that I had was able to sit across a person who had been harmed by the same type of crime that I committed. That 2 hours had more of an impact on me than the 13 years that I spent incarcerated. So when I think about, the brother asks, what's the purpose of prisons and so on and so forth, I think that we need to understand that incarceration stems from a larger system of racist oppression, that being, oppression and slavery and all of these things that come. So understand that we find that we really, there's little to no need for prisons. And we look at other parts of the world, right? There's places in India where cops don't even have handcuffs. People go voluntarily. There's places in Norway and other places in the UK where the prisons don't have any fences per se, or some of these cells even look like dormitories, and so if the purpose is to modify behavior, right, then we have to ask, does the current system doing that? A. B, right, this is just assuming that we're blaming the person, right? We look at the individual, but we don't look at the influencing factors that influence this person's behavior. One of my clients gets arrested for stealing a coat after getting released from Rikers Island without a coat. He's asked, well, why did you steal? We never asked, well, why would you release without a coat? So I just want to highlight, so in the event, right, because incarceration also causes harm, and incarceration promises you more incarceration. And folks need to understand that when you arrest someone, you're also harming them, and you're also traumatizing them in ways which exasperates whatever the trauma itself, and trauma works like that, But without going all over the place, when I think about the purpose of prisons, thank you. Yeah. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
If I could just quickly add to that, he mentioned Danelle Surratt and Common Justice and this idea of restorative justice. You need to pick up her book. She just released her first book, Until We Reckon. I, as a public defender, people assume a lot of the times that I don't care about public safety. I'm just trying to get people off, and I don't care about the victims. Of course, I care about both. I just have different ideas how to get to public safety that are not based upon mass incarceration, because I know that it doesn't make us safer. And I have different ideas about how to make victims and survivors of crime whole. And I know, especially after reading this book and working with Common Justice, that incarceration doesn't do that. The thing that stuck out to me the most is this idea of the fact that incarceration in prison makes violence worse, right? If we're trying to solve violence, what causes violence in the first place? I mentioned this earlier. The 4 primary drivers are shame, isolation, economic problems, and violence itself. Now, what do you think the 4 most common characteristics of prison currently are? All 4 of those things, okay? And so folks come out not helped, but harmed more. And there's evidence from this book to suggest also that, not evidence, there's overwhelming evidence that survivors of crime want something different, and they're not made whole, especially when they're given another option. So,
thank you. The 5th question, a gentleman asked, who will take the lead for a better criminal justice system?
Who'll take the lead? You will. We will.
Yeah, there's people in power right now that say that you want a policy. There's people in Albany right now from my New Yorkers who say that you want a policy that you don't want. And that's by default, because if you're not contacting these legislators, if you don't have your foot on their neck, then it's not going to work. They're not going to go up there and hold these folks accountable to the degree in which we need them to, unless we hold them accountable. And that's important. We're not going to get the kind of change that we want, and we can't ask for the type of change that we want if we're not also willing to make the kind of change that we want and get involved.
I think at the table, we're all experts in criminal justice policy, but I think the answer to the question is not going to be necessarily from the people at this table. The answer to how do we change the justice system is to ask, why do people in inner cities not have the same education than people in suburbs? Why is housing inadequate in the inner cities compared to other parts of the country? Why is there higher unemployment rates? Why is there less government support? This is the failure of government writ large to in fact give what the Constitution was supposed to provide everybody, an equal chance. So we can all do our part in our individual ways, but I think the answers around criminal justice has to be pushed upstream to where the major policy decisions that really affect people's lives, in their homes, their education, and how they make a living, whether it's Albany, whether it's the United States Senate, whether it's the House, those are the folks who I think we have to bring to the table and say, how are you going to deliver equal education, equal opportunity? And that's where I would spend much more time than we do.
Can I just add on to that, and this can sort of double as my ending statement, so we could save time on that. I think sometimes people ask, why does the federal government matter, given that the vast majority of folks incarcerated are in state prisons and jails, as opposed to in the federal system. The federal system matters because it can drive state policy, both financially as well as increasing public support for certain reforms. And we didn't really come back to the federal side, but that's okay. But let me just say 3 things that we think, in the research that we've done extensively at the Brennan Center, think would matter and could dramatically reverse the past 4 decades of growth in incarceration. First, federal government and states should end imprisonment for lower level crimes. We found in a 2016 study that 25% of people in prison could be better sentenced to alternatives to prison. So alternatives such as probation, community service, fines that are actually calibrated to people's ability to pay can safely cut incarceration rates and improve recidivism rates. Secondly, the federal government and states should shorten overly long prison sentences. This 2016 report we had also found that about 15% of people in prison nationwide, on top of that 25% of folks who could be sentenced to alternatives, are serving sentences that are far too long and can be safely shortened. And these 2 steps together would safely cut the national prison population, that's state and federal, by 40%. And then third, Congress should really pass a reverse of the 1994 crime bill. So if you're doing the math, that's 25-year anniversary this year. Most of the growth in the prison population has obviously occurred at the state level, but the federal government did accelerate the problem. Notably, the crime bill funneled money, billions of federal dollars that incentivized more arrests, prosecutions, and imprisonment. And we are proposing a reverse mass incarceration act that would totally be the opposite, that would incentivize states to actually reduce their prison populations without raising crime levels and having money go towards that.
Thank you. So the next question was, what's happening to the kids at Rikers?
All right, that one I can answer. Last year, the state legislature, was it last year, 2 years ago, the raise the age legislation, which meant that the criminal age of responsibility now in New York State, it used to be 16 years old, you could be considered as an adult. Well, New York was one of the last of 2 states to finally make 18 the age of criminal responsibility. So they passed that law. So last year, the 16-year-olds was cycled out of Rikers Island, and now those turning 17 are out. So they are no longer 16 and 17 years old in Rikers, unless well, anyway, they're not there. There's at Horizon, which is in the Bronx, another jail in the Bronx. Well, don't get me started on that, building a jail in the Bronx, closing schools, Rikers, Horizon. Anyway, they're in Horizon now, and they now go through the family court. And the legislature was supposed to make sure that there were more resources in the family court now to deal with young people so things could be more involved in programming and really getting to the heart of why these kids end up in the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. So they're there now, and there's less than 100 kids in Horizon. So it's not a lot, but we still have some. And some of them are charged with some serious crimes, and others are not. So they're there for the same reason. But the family court system is this. It's not a bail system. It is you're either in or you're out. So that's the system that the kids have to go through now. But they're really trying to do more to make sure that they don't have to be in while their cases are pending. They have pretrial diversion, probation handles them, things of that nature. So they're out of Rikers, and they're now in Horizon in the Bronx, which is a juvenile justice center. The Department of Corrections is there, but only temporarily. The ACS takes over there, so that means that their counselors are the one that do the primary, security for those individuals.
Thank you. And the last question from the questioners was, is there enough separation between PDs and DAs? She described a situation where one day a person's a public defender, the next day they're assistant district attorney. And does that create bias for defendants? Bias for defendants.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was an assistant district attorney first, and then I became a judge, and now I'm the DA. I mean, you just play different roles. All of them are in the same system. We play in the same space. So it depends on the individual. I know a lot of people that were assistant district attorneys with me who are now defense attorneys. And some of them understand the process even better because they were prosecutors at first. So it depends on the individual. I don't think it's because they were one thing and then another, so that means they're automatically biased or it's unfair. It depends on the individual.
Any other thoughts?
But I think that it's fair to say that, and I don't have the data to back this up, but I have the experience a little bit. You count the number of judges on the federal bench or the state bench who have a background in defense or prosecution. Lots of prosecutors, very few defense lawyers. And so the biases that come onto the bench, right, are lopsided in favor of prosecutors. Even like when Schumer, we used to have a say in who got to become federal judges. They're all ex-U.S. attorneys. They're not all ex-public defenders. I grant you that. And the other thing is, but I think it is true that former U.S. attorneys and former prosecutors do go on to become defense lawyers and tend to sort of represent a lot of the most high-profile cases. It's like weird, actually. It's not. I think it's not great, and particularly that so many judges are steeped in the prosecutor's mentality.
Any thoughts from this side?
I think in the answer to the question, I think it's a good thing in our justice system when a lawyer has been on both the defense and the other side. I was a defense lawyer for 20 years before I ran for district attorney. I think that's helpful to me to understand more broadly the issues of the cases that come before the office. So I think rather than it necessarily being a case of bias, I think it has educated me and enabled me to think more broadly. And by the way, I think you're seeing more elected prosecutors around the country who come to that job after working as a defense lawyer. I think that is increasing. And I think voters, by the way, I think think that's a good thing too, because they, I suspect, believe that if you've been a defense lawyer, you're going to have perhaps a more open mind on certain issues.
And I would even take that even a step further, I used to actually be in the intelligence community, and the fact that I'm able to bring my perspective when I'm fighting against the Muslim ban or doing other things, being able to work with those who are like-minded, who are in the intelligence community or FBI and so forth, on these things to say why that kind of thing is wrong, that kind of profiling is wrong. I do think that it helps sometimes with credibility when you've been on the other side and can bring that perspective to your work.
Thank you. Thank you all for the questions. So we're going to wrap up with some closing remarks. We're going to start with you, Reverend Mosley.
Stay woke, stay engaged, and keep the faith, baby.
What he said.
I'd just like to thank the National Action Network for this opportunity to come and appear before you. Sometimes people don't want to give district attorneys the opportunity to share the thought process we have and the real, compassion that we have for doing the work that we do. People paint us into a certain corner or think of us a certain way, and this gives me an opportunity for you to see the type of district attorney that the Bronx has. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you.
I want to thank the National Action Network for inviting me to participate as well. But I want to thank all of you who've come out this afternoon to take time out of your day to educate us with your questions. And I want to thank my fellow panelists, because we are often working in disagreement, but I think on many of the fundamental issues around human value and around where we want to see the justice system go, we are actually much more aligned, and I think and I hope that continues.
I also want to thank you all and thank my fellow panelists in the National Action Network, and leave you with this. We need to be aware of what got us to this point of mass incarceration. It didn't always exist. One of the main drivers was racism. We all know that. Another main driver is fear, okay? Policies passed because of gut reaction decisions decisions made and politicians using outlier cases to drive criminal justice policy. And voters who went along with it because they thought that was the right thing to do, because they too were reacting out of fear. So what I ask you all to do as voters is, as we, like in New York, begin to make really transformative change, and if you really want additional more transformative change that's going to make us safer, save a lot of money, and hold actors accountable while making survivors of crime feel whole, we need to have a tolerance for tragedy. Bad things are going to happen, and it's never okay, but one bad thing happening is not a reason to make the law harsher for all. Always remember that at the end of the day, the people who are going to be hurt the most, and we've seen it over the course of history, and we're seeing it today, are people who are living in poverty and people who are predominantly black or Latino, okay? So have a tolerance for tragedy. One last thing, I printed about 100 sheets with 4 different current movements that did not make it into the budget. So on solitary confinement, on parole, on legalization of marijuana, and, 50-A, police accountability, with information on organizations that you can tap into and movements that are happening right now between now and June. Feel free to pick it up after the event.
Yeah, echoing the thanks of not only being invited here, but all of you spending your time to sit through 2.5 hours, which is a long panel. But I'll tell you, I'll leave you also with this, that, in the quest of, in our journey to try to, change the criminal justice system, we have to be very careful to not remix it, in a sense, right? That although we're trying to, decrease the number of physical human cages that we have in this country, right, we have to be very mindful that we don't create these invisible cages by another form of surveillance, for example. And we lightly took on the first step back, and that's what if it wasn't for solitary confinement and the fact that it bans pregnant women from being placed in shackles while they're giving birth and also in solitary, we would not have supported it because it does have this long-term idea of people being surveilled in their communities and serving time in the communities, except that, you know, when upon closer inspection is really where we're building invisible fences. So I really want to warn against that. And then also the collateral consequences of the reforms that we want to seek, right? You know, we're celebrating, for example, Florida getting 1.4 million people who are just like myself, formerly incarcerated, with the right to vote. And that is reason to clap, right? And then at the same time that we celebrate that success, we must also look upon closer inspection and find out that piece of legislation excluded people convicted of violent felonies and sex offenses. So what does that mean, right? That means that in the next 10 to 20 years, there's probably not going to be a senator who's going to take the so-called sex offender or murderer bill to give them their voting rights back. So these people are completely disenfranchised for the very foreseeable future. The same thing with bail, right? We can eliminate cash bail, and we should. You know, but the consequences, right? You know, there's a study that came out of Maryland that showed that judges were actually not even giving folks the opportunity to even have, or even releasing them, while some people staying there a whole lot longer than averagely expected. And then, you know, so I want to warn against that, you know, and then lastly, you know, until we see people as people, we're never going to pass policies that recognize their humanity, right? You know, we have these names, right? Criminals, convicts, jailbirds. And when you come back and all this other stuff that really denies people's humanity. And that's because the system doesn't see the humanity. You know, we're called inmates and convicts, and you know, when you read this literature, right? And that is reflected. And I'll say this: it's real easy for me to pass a policy that impacts a criminal and puts him in solitary because he deserves it. But it's another thing for me to treat somebody's mother a certain way, although those may be one and the same, depending on what language I want to use. So I just want to leave that with that, and thank you again for having me here. Folks can contact me on social media or Mr. Johnny Perez. Thanks.
Well, I echo what everybody says. Thanks so much for having me here. Just to leave you with a few things. Just repeat again, the federal system matters because it provides money for states to incentivize states to do the right thing. So, you know, don't ignore that. As folks have mentioned about solitary confinement, I think it's one of the biggest human rights stains that we have right now in our criminal justice system. Not only is it inhumane, increases recidivism upon release, but it also aggravates mental health issues and people subjected to it, in particular young people, and it's extraordinarily expensive and doesn't work. So, you know, I think it's an issue we should all focus on. And remember too that when you're talking about these issues with people, don't ever let people move the narrative to this is a question about public safety versus rights of you know, justice-involved people. That you can maintain public safety, you can actually reduce crime by reducing incarceration. It's not an either-or. We need a better, smarter system. And then finally, vote on these issues, not only locally and with your state, federally. Lean on your public officials, get them on the record for what they're going to do, and hold them accountable.
Thank you all so much. Can you give them a round of applause? We're going to have a revival here at 7, you all, so stay tuned for that. Noel Jones.
Yo, let me give her the crap.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Here you go. Hold on a second. Let me.
Actually, guys.
You know, what do you think's the easiest way to do this? Let me just, you know, hold on a second. I'm going to put them out. Hold on one second. Guys. Johnny. What's that? Picture. What's the best way to? Okay, hold on. I gotta take a photo. So I'm gonna put like a number of piles here. Here we're gonna do some here. I'm sorry. I wish I like had thought about this ahead of time. I'm gonna put some down over this way. Wait. And if you need more, let me know. Well, just one moment. I got.